I'm very pleased to be here to take part in this event. Okay, thank you. Some of you know who I am. If not, I'll introduce myself. I'm David Forgacs. I'm a professor of contemporary Italian studies at NYU. And as such, what I work on is the very recent past and the present. And I thought it would be useful before we show this film by Michele Cinque, who's here. Very pleased to have the director here. And afterwards he'll be taking part in a Q&A with Stefano Albertini about the film. And in the course of that they will show a short film that Michele has made about the caporalato, a kind of more poetic film. It's a sort of musical journey, but it's also about the situation of these gang masters, the people who employ effectively slave labor. In fact, it's been defined as that in a court case of migrant workers, African workers in tomato picking in the south of Italy. So it's a very powerful film on a number of levels, but it's not directly connected to the first film, so we're showing that as a kind of sequel to show what happens to some of these migrants after they arrive. So the reason I want to take a bit of time before the film is to say a few things that I think are important to know to help everybody place this film in some kind of context. Now, I think some of you may know some of this already, and if you do, then I crave your indulgence for the next few minutes. If you don't know it, then I think it's helpful to know it to make sense of the film. Otherwise, it really doesn't have a context. So I want to start with this. Deaths at sea. People are dying in the Mediterranean. Some could be dying as I say this. And they've been dying for years and in huge numbers. There are so many documents about this that I can just show a few. And of course, Michele's film is itself a document. There is a part of the film in which you show some people who've been offloaded on a boat and they're dead. These very young volunteers have to deal with dead bodies. This is a report published this year, in January this year, so it's very recent, by the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. And it gives figures. These figures are always a little bit variable, but they give a pretty good idea of what's going on. You see from 2015, when there was over 1 million people crossing the Mediterranean, to now, when there's a much smaller number, but still over 100,000, the proportion of people who've died, 3,771 2015, 2,275 in 2018. And what's, I think, striking is the proportion has been going up. So although fewer people have been coming across, proportionately more of them had died at sea. What that means is if you now get on a boat on the north coast of Libya or Morocco, or if you cross from Turkey to Lesbos, you have a 1 in 50 chance of not making it, of ending up dead. So this leads to my next question: why is this happening? And if you ask that, not just why are so many people coming across, but why are people dying, you're going to get different answers according to who you ask. Many politicians and policymakers in Europe, that's national governments, but also at the level of the European Union, will tell you that people are dying because people smugglers are ruthlessly making money playing with human lives. They are taking money to put these people on boats. They don't join the boats themselves because it's too risky, because they get risk being picked up by police and being arrested. So they send migrants off in large numbers with enough gasoline to get them across, often not even that, sometimes a compass. They tell them to go in that direction and they'll get to Lampedusa, or they'll get to somewhere on the Spanish coast. The people who get on the boat have to pay a large amount of money to do that. Very often what they're doing is they're buying the boat because the boat might be destroyed, so they pay maybe several $100s, sometimes $1,000, more than $1,000 to get a piece of the boat to get on it. Now, many of these people also have never seen the sea before. If they come from a landlocked African country like South Sudan or Ethiopia, they are very likely not to have seen the sea before, let alone know how to sit on it and navigate a boat on it. Now, this answer, therefore, says that, you know, the problem is the people smugglers. They're charging money, they're ruthlessly exploiting people's lives, and if we were to somehow deal with the smuggling problem, the problem would go away. So the answer about the smugglers being part of the problem is true, but it doesn't really get to the bottom of what's going on. It doesn't explain why people are making the journey in the first place, and why they're making the journey by sea, and why they're making the journey by sea on these flimsy boats. And if you want to get an answer to that, you've got to understand that there wouldn't be a demand for the journey. There wouldn't be people smugglers if there wasn't a demand for the journey. So why is there a demand for the journey? And if we go a little deeper, we see that hundreds of thousands of people every year are making a very long journey over land. So the sea journey is just a stage. It's not even the last stage, because some of these people are trying to get to Germany or get to Sweden or get to the UK. Italy is just a transit country for them. Some of them do stay in Italy. Some are trying to get out of Italy because they've heard bad things about Italy. So if they've come from a country like in West Africa, like Ivory Coast or Senegal or Niger or Chad, or South Sudan, or from East Africa like Somalia or Eritrea or Ethiopia, they've had to get across the Sahara Desert, which has means a lot of money paid to a smuggler to get them on a truck across the desert. When they get to Libya, if they're coming on the central Mediterranean route, they nearly always then get put into a detention camp, and they have to pay money to get out of the camp to get to a boat, where they pay more money to pay a smuggler to get them across. And one of the worst parts of this story is what happens to them in those camps in Libya. Now, there's a trace of that. Somebody mentions it in the film by Michele, but this has been very well documented by human rights groups, by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International, that there is systematic torture and abuse of people in these camps. I was speaking to somebody on the phone yesterday who was a volunteer on the Aquarius, one of the NGO ships. It was operated by Médecins Sans Frontières and SOS Méditerranée. And she said the worst takeaway she had from the year that she worked on that ship was hearing the stories of migrants and how they'd been treated in the camp in Libya. All the women she spoke to, she said, had been raped, sometimes repeatedly. Some of those women were pregnant with a child that had been conceived out of these rapes. The men are often beaten with rubber hoses on their feet or on their backs. They are burned. We have a very, very serious violation of human rights taking place as a stage of this journey. And after that, when they get out of that, then they get on a boat where they risk dying. So that's just to give you a picture of what's going on. What I haven't said, of course, is why they're leaving these countries in the first place, but if you know a bit of the history of some of these countries, like, for instance, South Sudan or Nigeria or Eritrea, you know that these are places where there have been wars or civil wars or forcible conscription into the army, where you're in a repressive situation. So you're fleeing violence, you're fleeing war, possibly torture, and if you're not leaving for that reason, you're leaving for economic reasons because you just believe there's a better opportunity to survive and live in Europe, or you're joining a family member. And you don't make this journey without a lot of money. You have to have money to pay at each stage of it. So the people who are making the journey are not the poorest members of these societies. Sometimes they migrate within Africa. The people who cross across to Europe are people who've got some means to do this. And often they're quite highly educated. Some of them have degrees, and they're trying to use their skills abroad. Now, even this answer isn't complete, because I've explained why people leave and why they want to make the journey, but I haven't explained why they don't get on a plane, on a regular ship, or cross a land border at a legal place. That might be an obvious point, but I think it's worth making. After all, the money that they need to carry with them to make this journey would easily buy them a plane ticket. It would buy them a plane ticket in business class, right? But they can't get on a plane because they don't have documents. You can't get through an airport if you don't show a passport. If you manage to do that, you won't be allowed to land if you don't have a passport. So these people are forced to travel because they don't have documents by these means. And because the European Union has made a decision not to let people have easy access to its frontiers. So without these documents, without passport or an invitation to work or a work permit, you can't get into the EU. And the EU has been assiduous since the early 2000s in policing its external frontiers in order to stop non-EU citizens, what they used to call extracomunitari in Italy, but that's always poor people from the global south. It doesn't mean, for instance, US citizens. Extracomunitari out of Italy if they don't have documents. And this got worse really after 2001 because 9/11 and the so-called war on terror that followed it linked migration to a security risk. As anybody who's traveled since 2001 knows, airports are harder places to get through, and basically Europe tightened its borders to external entries also with this reason that security and terrorism was becoming a risk. So, people come by sea and they die at sea. And I want to ask now, how has the EU been dealing with this? Well, as I've just suggested, the problem is in large part of its own creation. The EU didn't make people migrate, but they did determine how they migrate and therefore how they die. At each stage of this history of Mediterranean migration, the interventions by national governments and by the EU have been reactive rather than proactive. What I mean is that they've responded when the crisis has become so bad they had to do something, but only at those moments. So at each crisis point, the first one I would say most recently was on October 3rd, 2013, when 359 people, that's the official figure, it might have been a little bit more, died, drowned in a boat very close off the shore of Lampedusa. And the last film we showed about the migration problem started with a scene. If you came to see that, the film is called It Will Be Chaos, and it opens with a scene of coffins being lifted onto the dock at Lampedusa, some of those bodies that were retrieved from the sea. That was such a bad case that the EU decided to do something, and they set up an operation called Mare Nostrum, Our Sea, which was a search and rescue, SAR, as it's called, SAR operation, run by the Italian Navy, which cost about 9 million euros a month to Italy, and the EU gave about 2 million euros towards it. But it ran out of money after a year. It was just too expensive to run. It saved quite a lot of lives, but when that ended in about a year later, October 2014, then NGOs, non-governmental organizations, stepped in. Volunteers, like the ones you see in Michele's film, chartered ships, and their point was to kind of fill the gap that was left by the government in doing something to rescue people. They sent these ships down to that risky area just off of the Libyan coast, and they tried to save as many people as possible and take them to safe places in Europe, where they could then file an asylum application and see if they could get legally into Europe. Now, the problem with the border control approach, I want to just show something here. Sorry, these are some of the websites where if you want to follow this, sorry, I've got something hanging over there, but this is the UNHCR's website. You can see the figures I've just been showing you there on the right, and this is kept up to date pretty much all the time. This one is another. This is the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, the UN agency that deals with migration, which has given figures up till a couple of days ago here, 28th March. So yesterday, 311 deaths so far this year in the Mediterranean. The EU's response to this was to set up a border control and surveillance and policing agency called Frontex. This is a still from Michele's film, where it says ferries, not Frontex. You actually see the same slogan in a march that is also in the film there. It's written in Croatian and in English. Sorry, Croatian and French. Frontex basically took the problem of intervening at sea, but it became a security issue. What they were trying to do was to stop people coming, not to facilitate them or to rescue them. It is not a humanitarian organization. It's a policing and border surveillance and control organization. So the EU's response, which is to tighten border controls, is clearly compounding the problem. It's not helping, and it's certainly not saving lives. You need to add one thing to that picture, which is what's been happening between Italy and Libya. Since the mid-2000s, Italy has had a series of arrangements with the Libyan government to either send people back to Libya to intercept boats at sea. This happened in 2009, where boats were simply turned around at sea. There was no investigation of who the passengers were, whether they had a legitimate asylum claim or not. They were just simply sent back. In some cases, they were sent back and they faced torture and violence. This then became a case that was brought before the European Court of Human Rights in 2012, and Italy was found to have violated various conventions and international treaties by doing this. The main one is the 1951 UN Treaty on Refugees, which says it is illegal to send anybody back to a place where they may be tortured or killed. This is called the non-refoulement clause, and Italy violated this clause. It also violated European conventions on human rights. So Italy was found wanting in doing this, but it didn't stop it from trying to go ahead with this process. So the next stage, which happened under the Gentiloni government, in other words, not under a government of the right, but a government of the so-called centre-left, was, and here the Ministry of the Interior was Marco Minniti, was have a new policy, which is to make a deal with the Libyan coast guards to intercept boats and take them back. But what that means, as I've just explained, is that they're being sent back to detention camps where we know they're being tortured, beaten, and so on. Right? This is a really nefarious arrangement, which 2 successive Italian governments have now been, in fact 3 have now been involved with, and it's been going back since 2009, 2008, and it started under Berlusconi, and it's now continuing under the government of Conte, Salvini, and Di Maio. Okay, with Salvini, of course, the worst offender as Minister of the Interior. He's the one who's been really leading this aggressive turn-back approach and trying to keep migrants away. In fact, if you've been following the story since the film, you'll probably know that last year, last summer, and last autumn, 2 boats were prevented from docking. Right? One, Salvini simply said, we're not going to let this boat land. There were migrants on board. They were hungry. There were children there. And he said, we're not going to let them dock. And so the boat then had to go to Valencia in Spain, where the Spanish took them in. And then the second case was a similar case where he refused to let a boat dock. And that then led to a deal involving the Catholic Church, and ultimately Albania and Ireland agreed to take these people. These are terrible cases. This is really a government that is saying, we're so frustrated with what the EU is doing, they're not helping us, Italy is being left to bear the brunt of this, that we're simply going to play games with human lives, put people out, keep people out at sea until the EU or some other country steps in and decides to do it. It's not our problem. At least this is how these politicians think about it. So all this explains, and it's just getting onto Michele's film there, why a number of NGOs decided to charter ships after 2015. There was another terrible series of accidents off the Libyan coast in April 2015 with 400 and 800 people drowning. That again, the EU reactively said we'll do something, but it didn't do very much. And at that point, it was organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, which provides medical aid to the SARS, SOS Méditerranée, right, which chartered boats and started operating in the Mediterranean, particularly around off the Libyan coast to intercept these boats. And that's what you see in the film. So this is the context I wanted to give you. And all this explains why so many NGOs, I don't know about the number, there were at least 15, I think, some Spanish ones, 3 German ones, some were multinational, operating in this. And the one that you see in the film was certainly the youngest. It was run by a German NGO called Jugendrettet, which means youth rescues, where rescues is a verb. And these young people, 19, 20, some late teens, early 20s, chartered a boat. They got a fishing boat. They made it over. They got people on board who had nautical experience and medical skills, and they went off to go off the Libyan coast to try and rescue people. And you see some of these rescue attempts in the film. So I don't want to say any more about it. I think I'll let you, I don't know if the word is enjoy, but certainly look at the film now. It's very, very powerful, both about these young people's desire to do something, and also, I suppose I can say a little bit about their naivety. They didn't quite realize what they were going to have to deal with when they tackled this, when they entered the Mediterranean. And you see very well what happened. If I can give a little bit of the story away, because it's really the last half of the film, or perhaps 25 minutes of the film, but it's also been mentioned in the description, so this isn't really a spoiler. The first action of the Iuventa, the ship, which means youth in Latin, which was manned by people from Jugendrettet, set off in July 2016. Just over a year later, on August the 2nd, 2017, it docked in the port of Lampedusa. It was told they were going to do a routine check, and the boat was impounded, sequestrata. It was a sequestro, and it was taken away from Jugendrettet, the argument that they had been aiding illegal migration. And the case went to court, and the argument was that they'd been taking people off these boats, leaving them there, and then these smugglers had been reusing the boats, and therefore they were helping further illegal migration. I'll let you make your own decision about what you think about that, but the evidence was very flimsy, just as the evidence against all the NGOs which were taken out of the water in 2018 by Salvini is very, very flimsy. I'll let you see the film. As I say, I'll mention afterwards there'll be a discussion with Michele Cinque and Stefano Albertini. In the course of that, they're going to show this short film, which lasts 15 minutes, about the caporalato. So, thank you.
Please welcome Michele Cinque. Grazie.
Michele, first of all, thank you for being here with us tonight, for having brought us your film. In New York, you just did a screening at the Italian Cultural Institute a couple of days ago.
Yes, but on another film.
Of another film about jazz and the Sicilian protagonist of jazz.
Yeah, let's say migration of 100 years ago. So
and that was Italian migration to the United States.
Yeah.
So there are two films about two completely different topics, but they're not so different. They talk about people that choose to go to another place to have a better life.
Yeah, I think jazz music is born from migration, so and history can teach us a lot about how to deal with migration. Italians were at the beginning of the century were vilified and were really there were a lot of racism episodes. So there's still some connections, I think.
Even if Italians in Italy now tend to forget that.
Yeah, definitely.
And they whitewashed the whole idea of Italian migration. We were all legal, we were all with our documents, we were all hardworking, and so we are different from the immigrants that come to Italy now. That's a common thing that you hear going around.
Yeah, I think it's a problem of the contemporary world that we have a very short memory.
Historical memory.
Yeah.
And especially the memory of the great Italian migration. We're talking about 9 million people that migrated between 1880 and 1920 from Italy to different parts of the world. That's a completely removed memory. It's like in history books when we study in high school, it's like 3 lines. These 9 million people disappeared into nothing, and it's not a topic that is discussed at all. I just want to make very briefly a short retrospective, because this is a topic that here we, on the other hand, insist on a lot in our programs, and especially in documentaries and film. So just very recently we had the screening of It Will Be Chaos. That's an HBO-produced documentary, but by 2 Italian documentary makers that were our guests, Lorena Luciano and Filippo Episcopo. And then we had last spring the presentation of Mediterranea, that is a 2015 film.
Jonas Carpignano.
Yes. So there is a continuity, and I see here we have in the second row 2 other documentary makers who made a film called...
good friends, I would say.
And their film was also presented here. And it's not exactly about migration, but it's about the difficult relationship of Italy with its own colonial past. And the film is Se quel guerriero fossi, if I only were that warrior. It's a quotation from Aida. And it's about the effort that were made in Lazio, in a small town in Lazio, to build a monument to Marshal Graziani that, as many of you know, might remember, was the infamous protagonist of the colonial fascist enterprise in Ethiopia. So the fact that Italy has not come to terms with its colonial past, it's definitely at the origin of much of the racism that we see today, and much of that racism is also shown in the non-ability to understand the real issues that are at stake with the problem of migration. So I just wanted to provide a further general background of a general discourse that we try to carry on here. So your film fits in perfectly, but now I want to ask you some specific questions about Iuventa. So you basically embarked with them in their adventure from the planning stages, then you were on the boat. So you lived the life that they did 100%. Very technical question. Was a crew of 1, or you were with somebody else working with you?
So it's a crazy project in production-wise, because I just, as I say in the beginning, discovered this story too late. Let's say for any production to jump in, or any support in terms economical or logistical. I just discovered the story 2 weeks later. I was in Malta. Actually, I was not expected to be with them on the first mission because they were scared. They didn't know me, and they decided that no camera would jump on the first mission because they didn't know if they were able to rescue people, because it's not easy, as you saw on the sea. So at the end, I stayed 3 days with them on the shore. They realized that I wasn't a journalist, but I was like someone that joined the project with his own skill. And I didn't have medical skill, I didn't have maritime skill, but I had film skills. So they asked me 15 minutes before the ship was leaving to join them. And so I'm a smoker, for example. I didn't buy tobacco because it was too late even to go, on the shore to buy something, whatever. And I remember, like the last hours that you have phone connection on the sea, since the boat left, with my editor that was on the project since day 0, and trying to build up a strategy of rules to not lose ourselves in the project, because it was a high risk of not really that all this material that at the end was 500 hours of shooting wouldn't come up in a film, because there was no writing behind, there was no all was happening in front of the camera. So yes, I was alone, just to say that I wasn't prepared. I left Rome with the equipment as I was going to be on board with them, with 5 terabytes of hard drive and all my lenses, but I mean, I didn't have my sound guy, so we have like 2 months of crazy sound production trying to recuperate, also
and clean up the tracks.
Yeah, it's like we passed from 5 different studios with different plugins to try to bring back some life of the sound, because it was a huge problem.
And actually, when you embark, you didn't even know whether you would have a story or not, because
but to me, the story was already there, because for me,
it was the story of these.
For me, it's not
kids.
a film on migration. Iuventa. Iuventa is a film on hope, and it's a film on Europe. It's a film on the youth of Europe that desires a Europe that respects human life and respect lives, no matter in which color it appears. So this was the story to me, and these guys shocked me, because I'm a generation older than them almost, and my generation was already lost in this, atmosphere that we cannot do anything, that we cannot change this world, that we cannot give our contribute, that where we shall start from, it's such a mess, and so my generation had already lost the hope, but these guys not. They were 10 students that, through a crowdfunding campaign, so through the new possibilities of internet, just 10 years ago this story wouldn't be possible, they were able to raise for almost 400,000 euros and buy a ship, and actually went there. So it was, for me, the story was since day one.
It's them.
Yeah,
and it's this extraordinary story of these young people, and we normally, including as academics and professors, this idea, they're constantly glued to their devices, to their phones. It's like they live in a virtual world. This is what the normal narrative is for the people of this generation. Yeah. It was incredible to see how practical they were, planning every single thing, despite the fact that they were not professional. And I think they have a discussion about how professional do you want to get in something like that.
That was the problem.
And so you need some degree of professionalism, because if you want to help people, you need to be able to do something, but you cannot be a professional of.
But once you get more professional, you lose your political power, because they didn't want to become, Mare Nostrum, the European, they didn't want to become professional. They just want to show Europe that if a bunch of students could buy a ship and went there, why Europe cannot do that? I mean.
And at the same time, they knew that the fact that they were not professional would give them this political leverage. And at some point, the discussion is now, how are we going to use the time that we have to lobby politically? So what is very impressive about them is that the fact that the virtual generation goes practical in a very intelligent and methodical way. The other thing is that they're very aware that they have to work on different fronts, and one is the rescue, but the rescue is not an end to itself, but it's only a form of exercising pressure on public opinion, and they're very careful. And so you basically gave them what they were missing, documenting their mission.
Although they understood this just when the ship was impounded, because before it was very hard process with them. Like I didn't imagine this film to be uh, uh, it's a multi-character film. At the end, the main character is the ship.
Yeah.
But I didn't want this from the beginning. I wanted to have like a character-driven movie with the founder, Jakob Shaw, and that it was 19. And till the first part of the film, the first act, the mission, he was, I mean, too in the action to really understand that he had the camera behind him. And then when we got back in Berlin, that was the real crisis. I mean, that was a very dangerous moment for them as well, because what you experience there is so meaningful that your life is no more meaningful. And this is very dangerous for a young teenager or
yes,
like
absolutely.
20-year-old boy. It was dangerous for me that I was 33 on board. Like, to go back, it's really something difficult. It's like post-traumatic war, or, you know,
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And but what I was thinking while I was watching it is that looking at these guys and the way in which you portray them, in simply in their discussions and their contradictions, and again in their practical ability to realize something, it's going to be impossible after having seen your film trying to paint them and the NGOs that do their work as colluded with smugglers and part of criminal organizations. That is a narrative that the current Minister of Interior in Italy is constantly trying to press and to push, and some of the press are buying into it. I think that nobody in good faith, after having seen your film, can have any doubt that these are exactly the opposite of what the far right in Europe is trying to paint them. So your film also has a very, very strong political meaning and power, because it really makes it impossible to think anything different about these guys than what they say at face value, because what they say is what they do, and they act according to their ideas. So
yes, I think I mean, Iuventa is a film with a lot of weak points, of course, and I know all of them as I did it, but I think its power is exactly the fact that everything is true. Like, I couldn't use some mise-en-scène. I couldn't scene. I couldn't stage. Sorry, I couldn't stage anything. So, and this, you can feel this from the film. And I mean, after the impounding of the ship, we were witnessing something that was very dramatic, because apart from, you know, being in touch with the most deadliest border of the world and huge suffering and pain, they, from one day to another, they become smugglers, or at least colluding, accused of being smugglers.
And criminalized, like a general blanket of criminalization for all the NGOs that were operating in Mediterranean.
Yeah, and this was from one day to another, and really shocked them. And the film, I have to say, helped them to get a voice back, especially in Germany, where the film did more than 400 screenings in cinemas. And we were invited in February to the European Parliament, where we had the screening. I mean, the film has become much more political, and I think the political part of the film is not that I wanted to you know, I didn't have a thesis at the beginning.
Yeah.
I didn't. I'm not an activist in the SAR or an SAR expert, and I think this is the power, you know, to when you don't have a thesis, that you leave the audience to actually think and understand and trying to make their own point on the story. And this is, I think, something that only documentaries can do. And it's the real political power of this form of film.
Absolutely. You wanted to tell the story of these people, of these young people. That's what you wanted to do, and that's what you did. Then it has a political value. It's undeniable. It's a very strong political value, especially in today's Europe. And I'm glad it has that power. A couple of questions from the audience, and then I want to talk to you briefly about your other film that we're going to show. It's a 15 minutes short. Any question on this film for Michele Cinque? Question, comment, statement? Yes, Emily.
My name is Emily. I'm a master's student here. Thank you so much for coming and presenting the film. It was really moving, and I think it helps provide lots of very important perspectives. My question is about, have you received any feedbacks from anti-migration groups saying we're all here as presumably because we agree that this is important and we want to do this, and how has your film engaged in discussion with people who are not so supportive of human rights, basically, and how has that been for you as a filmmaker rather than being a politician in this kind of thing?
Thank you, Emily. So the funny and let's say we come out with the film the same day Salvini closed the harbor. It was the first screening ever made of the film. And the day before came out an article on a far-right newspaper very close to Lega. That was actually, it was the first review of the film, but the film wasn't public. And they said, everything wrong about the film. But the fact that this film, it's this thing that we were talking, this natural part of it, this not structured way of narrating, it's somehow difficult to attack it in its form. And so we didn't have actually a direct attack on the film, but it was always attacked the co-producer, which is Rai Cinema, which is the public television service that after this attack didn't broadcast the film. So, for example, it's co-produced by two major broadcasts that actually, I was saying that I started alone, but after a year, when the NGOs was at the center of this huge shitstorm, and it's true. I mean, sorry for the word, but it's so then they jumped in, the co-producers, and ZDF broadcast it last summer, and France Television broadcast it 5 times in February.
German television and French television have presented it and broadcasted it.
Italian television not
that is
yet.
A co-producer.
Not yet, because
you're in good company. This happened to La Meglio Gioventù before you. It was produced by Rai, and then Berlusconi won the elections, and he prevented Rai from broadcasting it. So it went to movie theaters, and of course it went Cannes. And
there are a few other productions. Like
so you're in good company.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's a good sign. When Rai doesn't broadcast you, it's a good sign. It's a good sign. Also because they produce some major and some of the most incredibly talented Italian directors. So,
no, but I have to say, I mean, they are super supportive in terms of without Rai Cinema in Italy, we would really be. Already, it's very difficult to produce in Italy, but without Rai Cinema, that is supporting also. Rai Cinema jumped in the project before the story was, so famous. So they really believed in this idea of telling the hopes of Europe and its youth. So I have really to thank the guys of Rai Cinema, but afterwards it's political.
Yeah.
It's. So and then there come out a book with a direct attack on me by this. Let's say activist of far right, very near to
entire book against
No,
you?
it's an entire book about let's say what happened in the Mediterranean. But there is a part that's attacking publicly the film. But always the point is public television is producing something that wants us to think that NGOs are the good guys.
So, but nobody says that you presented things that are not true or that you try to manipulate reality or...
Not yet.
Okay.
Maybe it's...
You seem ready to answer to that. Yes? And any other question? I'll ask you a question that also... Please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. In your travels through southern Italy and Sicily, did you happen to notice how the young rescuers were being received by locals? I
Yes.
realize there's a language barrier, but what did you notice?
Thank you. Actually, Sicilian people are super supportive in terms of they are an island and they know that the sea is dangerous. And I've been meeting in this journey of 2 years around the sea and on the islands. We were also in Lesbos, and the Lesbos part is not in the film. Many parts are not. And all the people we've met, no matter their political idea, that knew the law of the sea, are really super supportive to these guys because they are making respect international agreements that European countries have signed, and so it's really as there is a prophetic sentence that the captain says on the beach in Sicily that he's not afraid of being accused because they are making respect the law. And they are still believing so. And there was a huge support. We never experienced some issues of real critics, apart from organized movement of, there is this movement, pan-European movement, that is called the Identitarian Generation, that is very much linked to all the far-right movement of Europe. And so on social media, there is the real fight. Let's say when we published the trailer of Iuventa, it was crazy, like all really terrible comments and let them die at sea, they don't deserve to be. So it's really a moment in which it seems that everybody can tell things that 5 years ago was a taboo, no? They were taboo, you cannot say that let's leave because they're black. Why? So it's a strange. In reality, I would say that we never experienced something really so aggressive. But then on the virtual side of it, it's really tough.
Yes, there was a question here.
I just wanted to make a comment about your film in terms of what you mentioned as this being a film about hope, and it really, I'm amazed at what an incredible story about humanity this really is, and it really shines throughout the film. You were really able to capture some moment of that humanity in the embraces between two strangers that are really bonding in ways that only human beings can. So it is such a beautiful story because I'm ashamed to admit I didn't know anything about this. So I came with, not really knowing much about it, but I'm really hoping that it's gonna get a lot of attention, and it's really a story that's so desperately needed because it's such a counter-narrative to this sense of despair and this toxic culture of hatred, nativism, anti-immigration feelings. So I just wanted to say thank you for doing this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And before we move to Jululu, do you say? There is something that was very interesting in the film, in Iuventa, that is the music, the soundtrack. And I wanted to know, in this film that was born like all of a sudden and you had to board, how much the soundtrack was something that you added at the end? How much was the soundtrack that these German kids had on the boat? Because it plays a role. And Jululu is basically a musical journey, it's defined. And we can say that it's what happens to some of these people, not necessarily them, but after they arrive, and for those, for example, who decide to stay in Italy, in southern Italy, and specifically in Puglia, where they are massively exploited in the agricultural industry there. But so the music first.
Thank you very much, because I'm a son of a musician and I did a lot of musical documentary. Actually, Iuventa is my first social documentary. and
A lot of music.
with a lot of music. And we had the chance, and it was really a very engaging experience to meet these amazing musicians that it's the Ake De Picciotto is a couple, and Alexander Ake is the bass player of a very famous German group of the 70s. That is really well known, Eisturzent Neubaut, and so I don't speak German. This was another problem of shooting a film in German, and I still don't speak it. So but these guys were, a co-producer at a certain point, a German co-producer jumped in as well, and they offered us to help us with the music. I wanted to have a soundtrack from Germany, because they are German, and no matter, I want to have, it was a very difficult choice, the music on this film. And we tried to, for example, in all the part of the ship, there are single notes sometimes that comes up, apart from the ending point of the mission. Because everything that we would place on the film was completely wrong, you know, because it's so delicate. It's a very sensitive film, because every element can destroy this sense of natural. The idea was to try to move to live their life for 2 years, to be with them, and to make this journey together with these guys. So the music was very important for the emotion. You saw that maybe the ending part of the film is the real narrative, the only, let's say, in editing kind of, there the music really is what leaves the emotion of the film. And we did a work with my sound designer that was very difficult, mixing the real music of the demonstration with this going in wrong tempos, and but still
in the crescendo of emotions.
In the crescendo, but with also with the music live, and so I think the music played the role of really scream at the end of the film. But somehow it was important, and I'm really glad I met these musicians.
Wonderful. Tell us something about Jululu.
So I know it's a long evening, but it's the first time I'm presenting these two films together, and I think they are very much linked. Jululu, it's a short film that was done during Iuventa editing. We just started to edit Iuventa, and we won a fund by the Italian Ministry of Culture that was about stories of migrants. And I was, during this journey, I was realizing that one big part of the problem, the biggest part is Libya, then there is the sea, but then what happens to these guys when they arrive? And so we realized that they would stay in a limbo for 2 years, requesting their documents, and then to the 95% of them, these documents would be denied. So they would get a paper saying, you have to go back to your country, but these people wouldn't have money again to go back to their countries. So what happens? They become illegal migrants, and they cannot work, and most of them end up in living in the street, and in the end of the gangmaster system, that it's in the southern Italy and in southern Europe, all agriculture is based on a new form of slavery. I realized really visiting these ghettos in southern Italy is full of ghettos outside of the cities where you cannot see, you cannot find it. If you don't know it, you would never find it. And it's like a province of the most remote village of South Sudan. It's really terrible condition of life, and prostitution, and every kind of, and these guys are there for the season of harvesting, basically, and they go from one region to another, because Puglia is very famous for the tomatoes, and but the thing is that also I've been speaking a lot with agriculture businessmen, and they are forced to use slave labor, because the big distribution of supermarkets that made the prices of tomato and made the price so low, the price for tomato, for example, a ton in Europe is 80 euros. 80 euros a ton. That means if you are, an agricultural businessman, how do you, there are two ways of doing that. Or you burn your tomato and you don't deal with this capitalistic system that wants every time more profit, or you get these new slaves. And so basically there is a huge necessity to have people with no rights to work for the condition of new slavery. So this was something that I realized. So I wanted to do also something different, because Iuventa was really demanding, and I couldn't write a single line of screenplay. It was really, and this is a completely opposite. There is a lot of fiction inside. It's shot with cinema camera, with big team and crew. And we were the only one to get access in one of these ghettos. You will see it, and it was really shocking. But it's a film, again, it's not a film about, the bad of this. It's a film about beauty. It's a film about, because I was coming from the film on jazz music, and this is a musical journey. The protagonist, there are two protagonists. One of the protagonists is a griot from Africa that he travels by feet in the region of Puglia, looking for the spirit. Jululu means the soul of the African people in one of the dialects of Senegal. And so he wrote, he's a singer actually, for real, and he wrote this song, Jululu, in which he says that the African spirit is no more in Africa. Maybe as drowned in the Mediterranean Sea, or maybe it's in the ghettos in southern Italy. The soul of the African people, it's somehow lost as well. So it was, and then we traced in these little narrow streets of the ghetto, and we found that also there were a lot of musicians inside the ghetto, and so we started playing with them and engaging jam sessions, and so it's a film also. It's a scream, of course, and but it's a film about beauty.
Thank you. And I think at this point we are going to greet Michele and thank him again for being here, because if we go beyond 9, I'm going to be put in jail for slavery, for enslaving like 5 students working for me, my staff and everybody else, and I don't want that. And I think you gave us what we needed to better appreciate Jululu. Thank you for your work.
Thank you very much.
We are going to have you back for longer. Thank you.
Thank you
and
very much.
Thanks to all of you.
I just want to add that if you want to have more information on Iuventa, there is, because we had so much footage, there is a website that is called iuventa.film, in which there are a lot of extras and deeper stuff on the investigation, on what is happening now, because 20 of these guys are risking 20 years of jail now. So, thank you.